Imagine losing everything in a single night. The walls that sheltered you, the bed where your children slept, the photographs preserving memories of loved ones now gone, all transformed into ash and smoke by an indifferent flame. What would you do when the fire trucks leave and nothing remains but charred timber and broken dreams? Where would you go when the road ahead stretches empty beneath a merciless sun, with 3 hungry children looking to you for answers you don't have? Today's story will take you into the heart of that impossible moment, when Sarah Miller, widowed just 8 months earlier, watches her family's Texas ranch home burn to the ground. It's a story about what happens when we're stripped of everything except what truly matters. It's about unexpected kindness from a stranger with his own painful history, and about how sometimes the most sacred ground isn't the land we claim, but the connections we forge in our darkest hours. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The smoke hung in the valley like a shroud, gray and choking, erasing the blue Texas sky that Sarah Miller had woken to just yesterday. Now she stood in the scorched remains of what had been her family's ranch, the blackened timbers of the house, still smoldering despite the firefighters' best efforts. Her cotton blouse stuck to her back, not from the lingering heat, but from the sweat of terror that hadn't quite left her body since the midnight evacuation. Behind her, her 3 children huddled in the shade of the only tree that had survived, the wildfire, an ancient oak that stood sentinel at the edge of what had been their garden. Emma, just 12, kept her arms wrapped around 7-year-old Josh, whose quiet sobs had finally subsided into hiccups. Tyler, 15, and trying so hard to be the man his father would have wanted, paced between the oak and the burned-out shell of their pickup truck, kicking at the charred earth with dusty boots. "Mrs. Miller?" The fire chief approached, his face streaked with soot, eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion. "We've done what we can. Fire's contained, but..." He gestured helplessly at the devastation. "I'm real sorry. Insurance folks should be out tomorrow." Sarah nodded, unable to form words around the knot in her throat. Insurance. David had always handled that. But David had been gone for 8 months now, his heart giving out suddenly, one ordinary Tuesday, while fixing fence on the north pasture. The insurance policy was in a fireproof box that was now somewhere in that smoldering ruin. "The shelter in Clayton's taking, folks," the chief continued, clearly uncomfortable with her silence. "Red Cross is there. They got cots, food." "Thank you," Sarah managed. We have my sister-in-law in Amarillo. I just need to call her." The lie came easily. Jenny had made it clear at David's funeral that family obligation went only so far as the casserole she'd brought to the service. The chief nodded, relieved. "Cell service should be back up by evening. You folks need a ride into town." "We'll manage," Sarah said, forcing a smile that felt like it might crack her face. "Thank you for everything." As the fire trucks rumbled away, stirring up dust and ash in equal measure, Sarah joined her children under the oak, their faces turned to her like sunflowers, expecting answers she didn't have. "We're going to town," she said simply. "We'll figure it out from there." "All our stuff is gone," Emma whispered, her voice small. "Even Dad's photos." Sarah's chest tightened. "Not all of them," she said, touching the locket at her throat. "And not all gone, just changed into something else." "Into what?" Josh asked, his face scrunched in genuine curiosity. Sarah looked at the ruins, at the smoke spiraling upward. "Into our next chapter," she said, though she had no idea what page they were on or how the story might continue. They gathered what little remained, a half-melted cooler with bottles of water that had survived in the yard, a singed blanket they shook out, Josh's backpack that had somehow been flung clear of the house. Tyler found his father's old hunting knife in the workshop, its leather sheath scorched but the blade intact. They began walking toward the county road, a small, smoke-stained procession. The sun beat down mercilessly as they trudged along the gravel roadside. August in North Texas showed no mercy, the heat rippling off the asphalt ahead of them. Sarah had pulled her hair back with an elastic she'd had around her wrist, but sweat still trickled down her neck. They'd gone perhaps 2 miles when Emma stumbled, her face flushed. "I need to rest, Mom," she said, her voice cracking with thirst despite the water they'd been carefully rationing. Sarah looked ahead. The town of Clayton was still a good 5 miles away, and the sun was only climbing higher. "There's shade up there." Tyler pointed to a copse of mesquite trees about 50 yards off the road. "We could rest till it cools, off some." Sarah nodded. "Just for a bit." The meager shade was better than nothing. They settled on the least rocky patch of ground, passing the water bottle carefully between them. Sarah watched the road, hoping to flag down a passing car, but it remained empty, a black ribbon stretching through the parched landscape. "What are we gonna do, Mom?" Tyler asked quietly when Emma and Josh had dozed off, exhaustion finally claiming them. Sarah met her oldest son's eyes, saw the fear he was trying to mask with determination, so like his father. "We'll get to Clayton," she said. "Call Pastor Mike, maybe. He'll know someone who can help till we figure things out." Tyler nodded, but his eyes said he knew it wasn't that simple. Nothing had been simple since his father died. A sound made them both turn, the rhythmic crunch of tires on gravel. Sarah stood quickly, ready to wave down whatever vehicle was approaching, but the sound wasn't coming from the road. Instead, a battered green pickup emerged from a dirt track she hadn't noticed, winding between the mesquite trees. It stopped, about 20 feet from where they rested. Sarah instinctively moved to stand between the truck and her sleeping children. Tyler rose beside her, his hand slipping to the knife at his belt. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with skin burnished by the sun, and black hair pulled back from a face of sharp angles and careful eyes. He wore dusty jeans, a faded blue work shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing muscular forearms and a silver and turquoise bracelet at his wrist. "You shouldn't be out in this heat," he said without preamble, his voice deep and measured. "Especially the little ones." Sarah stiffened. "We're just resting, on our way to Clayton." The man glanced at the sky, then back at Sarah. His gaze was direct but not unkind. "That's a long walk. You from the burned-out ranch?" Sarah nodded warily. He seemed to consider something, then said, "I'm Ray Tamakera. My grandmother's place is about 10 minutes from here. She's got shade, water, better than this." He gestured at their meager shelter. "We don't want to impose," Sarah said automatically, though everything in her screamed for water, for proper shade, for a moment to think beyond the next painful step. Ray's expression didn't change. "It's no imposition. My grandmother would be angry if I left you here." A slight pause. "I was hunting when I saw the smoke yesterday. Helped the fire crews with backburning near the creek. Saw your place." Another pause. "I'm sorry." The simple words broke something in Sarah. She felt tears threaten for the first time since the fire alarm had jolted her awake in the darkness. "I'm Sarah Miller," she said finally. "These are my children." Emma and Josh were awake now, staring wide-eyed at the stranger. Tyler remained tense beside his mother. "We'd be grateful for some water," Sarah continued carefully, "and maybe to use a phone." Ray nodded once, then returned to his truck. For a moment, Sarah thought he was leaving, but he reappeared with a large water jug. He passed it to her without a word. The water was cold, wonderfully so. They drank carefully under Ray's watchful eye. When they'd finished, he simply said, "Truck's got air conditioning," and walked back to the driver's side. Sarah hesitated only briefly before gathering her children and climbing into the passenger seat, the boys squeezing into the narrow back with Emma. The blessed cool air washed over them as Ray pulled away from the mesquite grove. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They drove in silence for several minutes, following winding dirt tracks through the scrubland that Sarah had never known existed, though she'd lived in the area for nearly a decade. Ray drove with the easy confidence of someone who knew every rock and turn. "You're Comanche?" Tyler asked suddenly from the back seat. Ray's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. "Yes. My dad said this was all Comanche land once," Tyler continued, "before the settlers." Ray's expression remained neutral. "It was." "Tyler," Sarah said softly, feeling the tension, but Ray seemed unbothered. "Your dad was right. This particular section was summer hunting grounds for the Penteca Band, my grandmother's family." The truck crested a small rise, and suddenly the landscape opened up before them. A creek cut through the parched earth, lined with cottonwoods, and willows that created an oasis of green. Nestled among the trees was a modest house with weathered wooden siding and a wide porch. A large garden stretched behind it, improbably lush in the Texas heat. Several outbuildings dotted the property, and a horse watched them from a small corral. Ray parked near the porch steps. "Wait here," he said, then got out and approached the house. An elderly woman emerged, her silver hair in a long braid down her back. She and Ray spoke briefly, her gaze shifting to the truck. After a moment, she nodded and went back inside. Ray returned. "You're welcome to come in. My grandmother, Helen, says you can clean up and rest. Phone line's down from the fire, but I can take you to town later if you need." Inside, the house was cool and smelled of herbs and wood smoke. Helen Tamakera was small, but carried herself with unmistakable dignity. Her face was deeply lined, her dark eyes sharp and assessing as they took in Sarah and her children. "The fire took your home," she said. It wasn't a question. Sarah nodded. "Yes, ma'am. We're very grateful for your hospitality." Helen's expression softened slightly. "No one should be without shelter." She gestured to a hallway. "Bathroom's there. I'll find you some clean clothes. Ray, heat up the stew." The next hour passed in a blur of blessed normality. They washed away the ash and sweat, changed into borrowed clothes that smelled of sunshine and cedar. They ate bowls of rich venison stew at Helen's wooden table with fresh bread and sweet. Tea so cold the glasses sweated. Josh and Emma's eyes grew heavy, the trauma and exhaustion catching up to them. "The children can rest in the back room," Helen said, leading them away. Left alone with Ray at the table, Sarah felt the enormity of their situation crash back over her. "I don't know how to thank you both," she began. Ray shook his head slightly. "No need." "There is," Sarah insisted. "You didn't have to stop. You didn't have to bring us here." Ray was quiet for a moment. "My grandmother believes that when the land brings people to you, there's a reason." He met her eyes. "The fire brought you here." "The fire destroyed everything we had," Sarah said, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "Not everything," Ray replied. "Not the important things." Sarah thought of her children sleeping safely in the next room, of David's knife that Tyler had rescued, of the locket at her throat. "No," she agreed softly, "not everything." Ray stood and carried their bowls to the sink. "You should rest too. We can figure out next steps when you're thinking clearer." Sarah didn't argue. The small bedroom Helen showed her to was simple, but comfortable, with a patchwork quilt and curtains that filtered the harsh sunlight into a gentle glow. She slept deeply for the first time since David died. She woke to voices outside the window, Ray and an unfamiliar man speaking in tense tones. Sarah rose quickly and found Helen in the kitchen, calmly kneading dough. "What's happening?" Sarah asked. Helen's hands never paused in their work. "County man says the fire jumped containment again, heading this way. Evacuation order for everything east of the creek." Sarah's heart sank. "You have to leave your home too." Helen's expression remained serene. This land has seen fire before. It knows how to survive. She nodded toward the window. Ray will take care of it. Outside, the stranger was climbing back into a county truck. Ray stood watching him leave, his posture rigid. "They're ordering evacuations," he said when Sarah approached. "Fire's changed direction." "We've brought trouble to your door," Sarah said, guilt washing through her. Ray shook his head. "Fire follows its own path." He looked at the horizon, where a smudge of smoke was visible against the sky. "But we should prepare, just in case." The afternoon passed in purposeful activity. Ray checked irrigation lines around the property, while Helen directed Sarah and the children in packing essential items, photos, documents, medicines. Tyler worked alongside Ray, learning how to wet down the roof and clear brush from around the structures. Even Josh found purpose filling water buckets with the garden hose. By evening, the smoke was thicker, the air acrid. Ray's expression grew more concerned as he returned from checking the eastern boundary of the property. "It's moving faster than they thought," he told Sarah quietly. "We should get you and the children to town tonight." "What about you and Helen?" Sarah asked. "We'll stay as long as we can. This land." He trailed off, his gaze sweeping. "Over the trees, the garden, the small house. It's been in our family since the reservation days. It's all we have left." Sarah understood with sudden clarity what that meant. This wasn't just property to them, but identity, history, survival. "We'll stay too," she said. "We can help." Ray looked at her for a long moment. "It could get dangerous." "We've already lost our home," Sarah replied. "We know what that feels like. We won't let you face it alone." As dusk fell, they gathered on the porch, watching the eastern sky glow ominously. Helen sat in a wooden rocking chair, her hands working a piece of leather with small, precise motions. The children were inside, finally asleep after the long day of preparation. "My husband's grandfather claimed our ranch during the land runs," Sarah said into the silence. "I used to be proud of that history. Now I wonder what it cost others." Helen's hands paused briefly. "The past is written. The future is not." "The fire department said they'd try to cut a fire break along the creek before morning," Ray said, changing the subject. "If it holds, we'll be safe." "And if it doesn't?" Sarah asked. Ray met her eyes. "Then we save what matters most and rebuild after." In the night, the wind shifted. Sarah woke to the acrid smell of smoke seeping through the windows. Ray was already up, his silhouette visible through the doorway as he spoke urgently into a radio. Outside, the sky glowed orange. "Mum?" Emma stood in the hallway, her borrowed nightshirt hanging to her knees. "Is the fire coming here?" Sarah pulled her daughter close. "Maybe. But we're with friends now. We're not alone this time." Ray appeared in the doorway. "Fire jumped the creek half a mile south. We need to move the horses and get everyone to the stone structure by the spring." The next hour was controlled chaos. Helen remained remarkably calm, directing them with the precision of someone who had faced emergencies before. The stone structure was a small building partly built into the hillside, with a metal roof and a natural spring bubbling up through the floor at one end. "My grandfather built this as a place of gathering and ceremony," Helen explained as they settled inside. "The spring has never failed, even in the worst droughts." Ray was the last to join them, his face grim. "Fire crews are focused on the town. They can't spare anyone for outlying properties." Helen nodded as if this was expected. "Then we protect ourselves." Through the small windows, they watched as Ray and Tyler dug additional fire breaks and wet down the ground around the Guillaume main house. The sky turned from black to sickly orange, then to a terrible roiling red as the fire approached. Ash fell like grey snow. Josh pressed against Sarah's side. "Is our new house going to burn too?" he whispered. Sarah held him tighter. This isn't our house, sweetie. But Mr. Ray said we could stay until we figure things out, Josh insisted. He showed me where to find the frogs by the creek. Sarah felt something constrict in her chest. The simple acceptance of her youngest, the way children could find home in kindness rather than walls. The fire came with a sound like a freight train, a roar that seemed to consume the very air. Through the window, Sarah watched in horror as burning debris fell onto the edge of the garden. Ray worked frantically to extinguish each new spark, a lone figure against the inferno. Without thinking, she rushed to the door. "Stay with Helen," she called to Emma, then ran to join Ray, grabbing a wet blanket on her way. The heat was incredible, the smoke disorienting. Together, they fought to protect the perimeter, smothering embers where they fell. Tyler joined them, his young face set with determination beneath the bandana he'd tied over his mouth and nose. For hours, they battled alongside nature itself. The spring-fed creek, though low, created a natural barrier that the fire struggled to cross. The ancient cottonwoods, their trunks thick with centuries of growth, refused to yield to the flames that licked at their bases. And then, as suddenly as it had escalated, the wind shifted again. The roar receded as the main body of the fire moved northward, leaving behind smoldering earth and the acrid smell of charred vegetation. Dawn broke over a transformed landscape. The garden was partially destroyed, the outbuildings scorched. But the house stood, protected by their efforts and some stroke of fortune. Beyond their immediate surroundings, the land was black and smoking as far as the eye could see. They gathered on the porch, exhausted beyond words. Ray's right arm was bandaged, where an ember had burned through his shirt. Tyler's face was streaked with soot, his eyes red-rimmed but proud. Sarah felt hollow, emptied of everything except gratitude that they were all alive. Helen emerged from the house with a pot of coffee and a quiet dignity that seemed untouched by the chaos. "The land remembers fire," she said, pouring cups for the adults. "It will green again." "The county man will be back," Ray said, his voice rough from smoke. "They'll be checking for damage, offering temporary shelters." Sarah nodded. Reality, settling back in. They needed to contact insurance, find a permanent place to live, enroll the children in school somewhere. The list seemed insurmountable. "You could stay," Helen said as if reading her thoughts. "This place has weathered worse." Sarah stared at her. "We couldn't impose—" "It's not imposition," Helen interrupted gently. "It's community. The old way." Ray looked at his grandmother with surprise, then at Sarah. "The guest house by the spring needs work, but it's solid. You'd have privacy and—" He hesitated. "I could use help rebuilding the garden, tending the horses. Tyler seems to have a way with them." Sarah looked at her children. Emma was helping Josh count the frogs that had survived in the mud by the spring. Tyler stood straighter, a new confidence in his posture, despite the exhaustion. "Why would you do this for us?" Sarah asked. "You barely know us." Helen's weathered hand covered Sarah's. "Because the fire brought you here. Because you stayed when you could have left. Because your children have good spirits." She smiled, slightly. "And because this land has always been a place of healing." "It's sacred ground," Ray explained, "not in the way outsiders think, with ceremonies and mysticism. Sacred because it has sustained our family through drought, through forced relocation, through everything the world has thrown at us. It remembers who we are." Sarah thought of the ranch she'd lost, how it had never truly felt like hers even after years of living there. She'd been a caretaker of David's inheritance, never quite belonging. "I don't know the first thing about gardens or horses," she admitted. Ray actually smiled, a brief lightening of his serious face. "You know how to fight fire. The rest can be learned." The weeks that followed were a blur of activity. The guest house required substantial work to be truly habitable. A leaking roof needed patching, walls needed insulation, and all of it needed cleaning. Ray worked on it each morning, before the worst heat of the day set in. with Tyler eagerly learning each skill alongside him. Sarah spent her days helping Helen restore the garden, salvaging what they could and replanting where necessary. Emma took to following Helen around, fascinated by the older woman's knowledge of plants and their uses. Josh appointed himself official frog counter, keeping detailed notes in a small notebook Helen had given him about the gradual return of wildlife to the scorched areas. In town, Sarah navigated the labyrinth of insurance claims and disaster assistance. The payout would come eventually, they assured her, but bureaucracy moved at its own pace. Pastor Mike had organized donations of clothing and school supplies, and the community college offered Sarah a part-time position in their administrative office. Flexible hours that would allow her to be home when the children returned from school. Life began to find a new rhythm, different from what Sarah had known before, but not entirely unwelcome. The children enrolled in the local school, catching the bus at the end of the long driveway each morning. In the evenings, they would gather at Helen's table, sharing meals and stories as the daylight faded. Ray remained somewhat of a mystery. He was often gone before dawn, hunting or working odd jobs in the surrounding counties. He would return with game for the freezer or supplies for the ongoing repairs, quiet but observant. Sarah found herself watching for his truck, aware of the strange comfort his presence brought. One evening in late September, Sarah sat on the porch of the guest house, looking out at the scorched landscape where new green was already emerging from the blackened earth. The sound of Ray's truck approaching drew her attention. He parked near the main house, but instead of going inside, he walked toward her, carrying something wrapped in cloth. "Evening," he said, stopping at the bottom of the steps. "Evening," Sarah replied. "Helen's got stew on if you're hungry." Ray nodded but didn't turn to go. Instead, he held out the wrapped object. "Found this today. Thought you might want it." Sarah took it, curious. Unwrapping the cloth, she found a small, tarnished silver picture frame. The glass was cracked, the photograph inside smoke-damaged but still visible. Her husband David, standing proudly beside their ranch house the day they'd moved in. "Where did you—" she began, her voice catching. "County's clearing the burn. Sites. Insurance assessors are done with your property. I stopped by, thought there might be things they missed." Ray's eyes met hers. "There's a few other items. Tyler's baseball trophies were in a metal cabinet that survived. Some kitchen things. I can take you there tomorrow if you want to see for yourself." Sarah traced her finger over David's face. "In the photograph." "Thank you," she said softly. "Not just for this, for everything." Ray looked uncomfortable with her gratitude. "You've been pulling your weight. Helen hasn't been this energetic in years. She likes having your family here." "And you?" Sarah asked before she could stop herself. Ray was quiet for a moment. "I grew up hearing stories about how this land used to be filled with our people, how the valleys echoed with voices. It's been just Helen and me for a long time." He glanced toward the main house, where laughter could be heard as the children helped with dinner. "It's good to hear life here again." The next day, Ray drove Sarah back to what remained of her ranch. The sight was jarring, the blackened shell of the house surrounded by cleanup crews and heavy machinery. Most of the debris had been cleared away, leaving only the foundation and chimney standing like grave markers. They walked carefully through the site, Ray pointing out areas where he'd found salvageable items. In what had been David's workshop, they discovered a metal toolbox welded, shut by the heat. Ray pried it open with a crowbar, revealing David's prized woodworking tools, scorched but intact. "He used to make furniture," Sarah said, picking up a hand plane. "Promised to teach Tyler when he got older." Ray examined the tools. "Good steel. They'll clean up." "He would have liked you," Sarah said suddenly. "David. He respected people who knew the land." Ray looked at her, something unreadable in his expression. "He chose good land," This valley catches rain even in drought years. They continued searching, finding a few more treasures. A ceramic platter Sarah's mother had given them as a wedding gift, buried under ash but unbroken. David's old tackle box with fishing lures still inside. A garden statue of St. Francis that had survived with only smoke damage. As they were loading the items into Ray's truck, a sleek black SUV pulled up beside them. A man in an expensive suit stepped out, consulting a tablet. "Mrs. Miller?" he called, approaching with an outstretched, "And Brian Weston with Greenpath Development. Got a minute?" Sarah shook his hand cautiously. "What can I do for you?" "I'll be direct, Mrs. Miller. My company is interested in purchasing your property. We've been acquiring parcels in this area for a new residential community. Premium. Prices, cash offers." He glanced at the burned foundation. "Given your circumstances, I think you'll find our offer very generous." Sarah felt Ray stiffen beside her. "I haven't decided what I'm doing with the property yet," she said carefully. Weston smiled, all perfect teeth and practiced charm. "Of course, no rush, but I should mention that we've already acquired the Henderson and Jacobson properties that adjoin yours. The whole area is going to be transformed. Beautiful homes, golf course, shopping center, real progress for Clayton." Ray spoke, his voice neutral but with an underlying edge. "The creek that runs through here feeds the entire watershed. Development would impact water quality downstream." Weston's smile dimmed as he looked at Ray, noticing him properly for the first time. "And you are?" "A friend," Sarah said before Ray could answer. "Mr. Weston, I appreciate your interest, but now's not the time. If you'd like to leave your card, I'll contact you when I've made decisions." Weston handed her a business card with reluctance. "Don't wait too long, Mrs. Miller. These opportunities have timelines." He looked pointedly at Ray. "And I'd get independent advice about your options." After he'd driven away, Sarah turned to Ray. "What did you mean about the creek?" Ray's face was tight with barely contained anger. "That man's company has been buying up ranch land all over the county. They drain wetlands, redirect creeks, pack in houses too close together. The runoff pollutes everything downstream." He looked at the burned remains of her home. "This land deserves better." "It's just land," Sarah said, though she didn't entirely believe it. Ray shook his head. "No such thing as just land. Everything connects. The water that flows through here reaches our creek, feeds our garden." Sarah looked across what had been her property, seeing it differently now, not as isolated acres, but as part of a living system that extended far beyond property lines. "I don't have to decide right away," she said finally. Ray nodded, his attention easing slightly. "No, you don't." On the drive back, Sarah was quiet, turning the business card over in her hands. The money would solve so many problems. They could buy a new home, replace everything they'd lost, start fresh without being dependent on others' charity. "Helen told me a story once," Ray said suddenly, breaking the silence, "about how her grandfather planted every cottonwood along our creek by hand during a drought year. People thought he was crazy, wasting water on trees when crops were failing, but he said the trees would call the rain, that they'd be there for his grandchildren's." "Grandchildren? And were they?" Sarah asked. "Those trees saved our house last week," Ray replied. "Sometimes we plant things we'll never see grow." When they returned, the children were excited about their salvaged treasures. Josh clutched his father's fishing tackle like it was made of gold. Emma carefully cleaned the ceramic platter, placing it on their small makeshift shelf. Tyler disappeared into the workshop with his father's tools, emerging hours later with sawdust in his hair and a quiet determination in his eyes. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She sat on the porch of the guest house, staring at the developers, charred in the moonlight. The offer would come with a price that couldn't be measured in dollars, the erasure of David's family legacy. The transformation of farmland into suburban sprawl, the disruption of the watershed that connected her old home to her temporary sanctuary. A soft footfall made her look up. Helen stood at the bottom of the steps, wrapped in a shawl against the night chill. "Mind if I join you?" the older woman asked. Sarah gestured to the chair beside her. "Couldn't sleep?" "Old bones know when decisions are being made," Helen said, settling into the chair with a soft grunt. "They get restless." Sarah smiled despite herself. "Ray told you about the developer." "Ray tells me everything in his way." Helen looked out at the moonlit landscape. "When I was a girl, my father worked for a rancher over near Archer City. Good man, fair boss. When he died, his son sold the land to an oil company. They drained it dry, left it poisoned. My father had to move us, find new work. That land never recovered." She turned to Sarah. "But that was his choice to make, not ours." "This is my choice," Sarah said, holding up the business card. "Yes, and no small one." Helen's eyes were kind in the darkness. "Land remembers what we do to it, chooses whether to forgive." Sarah felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her. "I have to think of my children, their future." "All choices should be made that way," Helen agreed. "But remember that future is a longer road than most people see." The following Sunday, Sarah took the children to church in Clayton for the first time since the fire. Pastor Mike greeted them warmly, the congregation surrounding them with hugs and casseroles to take home. After the service, Sarah found herself surrounded by well-meaning neighbors offering advice. Martha Jacobson got nearly twice what her place was worth from those developers, whispered Judy Barton, the postmaster's wife. "She's moving to Arizona, buying a condo. No more worrying about droughts or property taxes." "Best thing that could have happened," agreed Tom Fletcher, who owned the hardware store. "Clayton needs the growth, bring in new businesses, new opportunities for our kids." Sarah nodded politely, but her mind kept returning to Ray's words about the watershed, about connections that went beyond property lines. After church, they drove past what had been the Jacobson Ranch. Heavy machinery had already moved in, scraping the earth bare. The creek that had once meandered through cottonwood groves had been redirected into a straight channel lined with concrete. "What are they doing?" Emma asked, pressing her face to the window. "Building new houses," Sarah explained. "But they're ruining it," Emma protested. "Where will the animals go?" Sarah had no answer. She drove on, taking the winding back roads that led to the Tamakera property. As they crested the final rise, the contrast was stark, the scorched earth giving way to the oasis of Helen's garden, the creek flowing naturally between ancient trees. That evening, Sarah sat at Helen's kitchen table, nursing a cup of tea, while the older woman prepared vegetables for dinner. "I saw the Jacobson place today," Sarah said finally. Helen's hands continued their steady work. Not much left to see, I'd guess." "No," Sarah agreed. "It's different." "Land has a face," Helen said, setting down her knife. "When you live on it long enough, you come to know it like you know your own child. Some changes are like watching your child grow up. Others," she gestured vaguely, "others are like watching them become someone you don't recognize." Sarah thought of the concrete channel where the creek had been, the bulldozed fields. "I don't think I could do that to my land." Helen smiled slightly at the slip. "Then don't. But we need a permanent solution. We can't stay here forever." "Why not?" The question came from Ray, who had entered silently through the back door. He set a basket of freshly dug potatoes on the counter. "The guest house will be finished by winter. The children are settling in at school." He hesitated. "There's room here for another family. Always has been." Sarah stared at him, trying to understand what he was suggesting. "You mean stay permanently?" Why not? Ray repeated. Tyler's got skill with the horses. Emma's learning the garden faster than Helen can teach her. Josh has named every frog within a mile radius. His voice softened. And you belong here now too. We can't just... Sarah began, then stopped. What are you saying exactly, Ray? Ray looked to his grandmother, who nodded slightly. I'm saying we make it official. Your family and ours. Shared land, shared work, shared future. Legal partnership. If that's what you need, or... He trailed off, clearly uncomfortable with the directness of his own proposal. The weeks melted into months as autumn deepened across the Texas landscape. The blackened earth began its slow transformation, sprouting tender green shoots after the first rainfall. Nature's resilience never ceased to amaze Sarah as she watched. Life returned to the scorched terrain surrounding Helen's property. The guest house had become a true home for her and the children. Ray had worked tirelessly on the renovations, replacing damaged floorboards, repairing the leaky roof, and installing new windows that Tyler had helped sand and finish. Emma had taken to decorating with found treasures, feathers, interesting, stones and wildflowers pressed between glass frames that Helen had taught her to make. Even Josh had claimed his space, arranging his growing collection of frog drawings and nature observations on the wall above his bed. Sarah stood on the small porch of the guest house, coffee mug warming her hands in the early morning chill. From this vantage point, she could see across the valley to where her former ranch lay, now just a distant shape on the horizon. The insurance money had finally come through last week, forcing a decision she'd been avoiding. Morning, Ray's voice came from the pathway. He approached with a toolbox, dressed in work clothes already spotted with sawdust. Thought I'd finish the cabinet today, if that's okay. Sarah nodded, gesturing toward the house. The children are still asleep. School holiday. Ray set down his tools and leaned against the porch railing. Heard anything from that developer? Another call yesterday, Sarah admitted. They've increased their offer. She hesitated. Significantly. Ray's expression remained carefully neutral. And I told them I'm still considering my options. Silence stretched between them, comfortable yet charged with unspoken possibilities. In the 3 months since the fire, their relationship had evolved into something neither of them had anticipated. A partnership built on shared work, mutual respect, and the gradual realization that they fit together in ways that defied easy explanation. Helen says the first frost will come next week, Ray finally said, changing the subject. We should harvest the last of the tomatoes, Sarah smiled. Emma's already planned a canning day. She's got Josh measuring mason jars. Ray's face softened at the mention of the children. That girl's gonna run the world someday. If she doesn't drive us all crazy first, Sarah laughed. She paused, then added, Thank you for the books you brought her, about native plants. She's memorizing Latin names now. Good knowledge to have, Ray said simply, connects her to this place. The mention of connection hung in the air between them. Sarah took a deep breath. The school called yesterday. Asked if I'd made a decision about enrollment for next semester. They need to know if the children are staying. Ray looked at her steadily. And what did you tell them? That I'd let them know by Friday. Sarah set down her coffee mug. Ray, what we talked about last month. About us making this arrangement permanent. Were you serious? I don't say things I don't mean. His gaze remained unwavering. But it has to be your choice, completely. No obligation, because we helped when you needed it. Sarah thought about the past months, how Tyler had blossomed working alongside Ray with the horses, how Emma had found a kindred spirit in Helen and her vast knowledge of plants, how Josh's nightmares had finally stopped. She thought about the quiet evenings on Helen's porch, learning the stories of the land, and the gradual healing that had taken place not just in the earth, but in her own heart. It's not obligation, she said softly. It's belonging. The children feel it too. Ray nodded, a barely perceptible release of tension in his shoulders. Helen's been making lists of what we'd need to add to the house. More bookshelves, she says. Your kids have too many books. The hint of a smile touched his lips. We could contribute the insurance money, Sarah offered. For improvements, expansion. Make it truly a shared home. And your ranch? Ray asked, his voice careful. Sarah hesitated. The developer's offer represented financial security, a safety net for her children's future. But the thought of the land being transformed into a suburban development with the creek diverted and the natural habitat destroyed sat like a stone in her stomach. I've been thinking about that, she said slowly. What if we kept it, but differently? Not to rebuild, but to restore it. Let it heal naturally, maybe plant native grasses, create a wildlife corridor. Ray's expression changed, a sudden intensity in his eyes. A conservation easement, he said. Legal protection for the land, tax benefits, prevents development. Permanently. Is that possible? Sarah asked, surprised by his immediate understanding. More than possible. The Tribal Conservation Office has been working with ranchers throughout the watershed to create connected protected areas. Your land is a key piece. It connects the eastern forest with the riparian zones along the creek system. Sarah felt a weightlifting, so it could remain wild, healing. It would be an extraordinary gift, Ray said quietly, to the land, to the future. He looked out across the valley, and a fitting memorial to your husband. The mention of David brought an unexpected comfort rather than pain. Ray had never met him, yet somehow understood the legacy David would have wanted to leave for his children. I'd need help, Sarah admitted. I don't know the first thing about conservation easements or land restoration. I know people, Ray said simply. Good people who've been doing this work for years. They can guide us through it. Sarah noted the us with quiet appreciation. I'll call the developer today. Tell them the land is not for sale. Ray's smile was rare and transformative. That'll be a good call. The sound of the screen door opening interrupted them as Josh bounded out in pajamas, wild-haired and excited. Mom, Mr. Ray, the frogs by the spring had babies, hundreds of tadpoles. Come see. Ray ruffled the boy's hair. Let your mom finish her coffee, wild one. Then we'll all go look. Josh beamed up at him, the easy affection between them a testament to how far they'd come. Can we build them a better pond? The spring gets muddy when it rains. Might be a good weekend project, Ray agreed. We'll draw up plans. Josh ran back inside, calling for his siblings to wake up and see the tadpoles. He doesn't talk about going back anymore, Sarah observed. To our old place, none of them do. Children adapt, Ray said. They know where home is. Sarah met his eyes. So do I. 2 days later, Sarah stood in the office of Marianne Rodriguez, the county's conservation program director, watching as the woman spread maps across her desk. Your timing is perfect, Mrs. Miller, Marianne explained, tracing a finger along the watershed lines. We've been trying to create a continuous protected corridor along this creek system for years. Your property is a critical link. Ray stood beside Sarah, occasionally offering clarifications about the land's features. And this would be permanent, Sarah asked. No future owner could develop it? That's the purpose of a conservation easement, Marianne confirmed. You retain ownership, but development rights are permanently restricted. The land must remain in its natural state, with allowances for sustainable activities like limited grazing or educational programs. What about financial implications? Sarah asked, thinking practically. Property taxes, maintenance costs? Property taxes are significantly reduced on conservation land, Marianne explained, and there are grant programs available for restoration projects. Some families even create small nature education programs that generate modest income while serving the community. Ray nodded. The tribal conservation program offers support for native plant restoration. They'd consider your property high priority. Sarah studied the maps, seeing her land not as an isolated parcel, but as part of a living system extending far beyond property lines. The decision felt increasingly right. What would be the first steps? She asked. Marianne smiled, sensing her commitment. We conduct a full ecological assessment, document current conditions, develop a restoration plan, and draft the legal easement. It typically takes 3 to 6 months. And during that time, Sarah asked, the land begins healing itself. Ray answered before Marianne could respond. Nature knows what to do if we let it. On the drive back to Helen's property, Sarah felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced since before David's death. The weight of uncertainty about their future had lifted, replaced by a clear vision of possibility. The children will be disappointed we can't rebuild the house, she mused aloud. Ray glanced at her. They might surprise you. Tyler was saying just last week that he prefers being closer to school and his new friends. He told you that? Sarah asked, surprised. Her oldest had become increasingly private as he navigated adolescence. While we were fixing fence, sometimes it's easier to talk when your hands are busy. Sarah smiled. You're good with him, with all of them. Ray kept his eyes on the road. They make it easy. Good kids. When they returned home, they found Helen and the children gathered around the kitchen table, maps and drawings spread across the surface. Emma looked up eagerly as they entered. Grandma Helen's teaching us about the old trails, she exclaimed, using the term of affection she'd adopted for the older woman. The ones her ancestors used. Helen smiled, her weathered hands tracing lines on a hand-drawn map. Just passing along what my grandfather taught me. These children are quick studies. Tyler stood at the edge of the table, examining the maps with intensity. Did your family use the trails that crossed our ranch? He asked Sarah. Our old ranch, she corrected gently. And I don't know, honey. That's something we should learn about. That whole area was Comanche hunting territory, Helen explained. The creek system was a travel route for generations. Sarah exchanged glances with Ray, who nodded slightly, encouraging her to share their news. She pulled out a chair and sat down. I have something important to tell you all, she began. I've made a decision about our old property. The children gathered closer, sensing the significance of the moment. We're not going to sell it to the developers, Sarah explained, and we're not going to rebuild our house there either. Then what? Tyler asked, his brow furrowed. We're going to protect it, Sarah explained. Keep it wild, help the plants, and animals return. It's called a conservation easement. Emma's eyes widened, like a nature preserve. Very similar, Ray confirmed. The land will be allowed to heal and return to its natural state. What about where we're going to live? Josh asked, the practical one despite his young age. Sarah took a deep breath. I've been talking with Ray and Helen. If everyone agrees, we'd like to make our arrangement here permanent, expand the house, become one family. A moment of silence followed as the children processed this information. Does that mean Ray would be like our dad? Josh asked bluntly. Sarah felt heat rise to her face. Ray would be Ray, she said carefully. No one will ever replace your father, but we would be a family, yes, a different kind of family. I think Dad would like that, Tyler said quietly, surprising everyone. He always said land should be respected, and he'd want us to be happy. Emma nodded vigorously. I want to stay here with Grandma Helen and learn all the plant medicines. And my frogs, Josh added. They need me. Helen's eyes glistened with unshed tears. The house has been too quiet for too long, she said softly. It remembers when children's voices filled it. Ray placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder, a gentle touch of support. We thought we might build an addition off the east side, more bedrooms, a larger kitchen. Everyone would have their own space, but we'd be together. Can I help design it? Tyler asked, suddenly animated. I've been studying Dad's woodworking books. I have ideas. We'll need all the ideas we can get, Ray assured him. Later that evening, after the children had gone to bed, Sarah, Ray, and Helen sat on the porch watching the stars emerge. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke from the fireplace inside. I never imagined this outcome, Sarah confessed. When the fire took everything, I thought we'd lost any chance at stability at home. Helen's knitting needles clicked rhythmically in the darkness. Fire clears the way for new growth, always. There will be challenges, Ray said pragmatically. Combining families isn't simple. Nothing worthwhile ever is, Helen replied. But these children have already claimed this land as their own, and it has claimed them. Sarah thought about the way Emma now moved through the garden with confidence, identifying plants by both their common and scientific names. How Tyler had taken to sitting with Ray in comfortable silence, learning to read the weather and the seasons. How Josh collected natural treasures with the dedication of a born naturalist. The restoration project on the ranch will take years, she said thoughtfully. The children will grow up watching that land heal. Good teachers. Both the land and the process, Ray observed. They'll learn patience, persistence, how systems work together. And responsibility, Helen added. Caretaking something beyond themselves. The conversation drifted into comfortable silence. Sarah found herself leaning slightly toward Ray, their shoulders almost touching. The physical proximity still felt new, tentative, but increasingly right. I should check on the children, she said, eventually standing. Ray nodded. I'll be bringing more firewood in before turning in. Winter's coming early this year. I can feel it. As Sarah moved toward the door, Helen called after her. Sarah, I've been meaning to give you something. She reached into her knitting bag and withdrew a small leather pouch. This belongs on the land you're protecting. My grandfather removed it when the settlers came to keep it safe. It should return now. Sarah accepted the pouch curiously. Inside was a smooth stone pendant on a leather cord, etched with symbols she didn't recognize. It's a boundary marker, Helen explained. In the old days, it signified protected ground, sacred space where all were welcome but none could harm. It's beautiful, Sarah whispered, feeling the weight of history in her palm. When the easement is final, we'll return it to the land together, Helen said. Complete the circle. That night, Sarah dreamed of fire, not the destructive inferno that had consumed their home, but a controlled, cleansing flame that moved across the landscape, leaving renewal in its wake. She woke with the first light of dawn. A sense of rightness settled deep in her bones. The following weeks brought a flurry of activity. The conservation assessment team visited the ranch property, documenting plant species, soil conditions, and wildlife evidence. Sarah walked the land with them, seeing it through new eyes, not as a loss, but as a promise. They identified springs she hadn't known existed, fossil evidence in the creek banks, and signs of returning wildlife, already reclaiming the burned areas. At Helen's property, their home now, planning began for the expansion. Ray and Tyler drafted preliminary designs, spreading papers across the dining table each evening. Emma contributed garden plans, insisting on larger growing spaces and a greenhouse for winter. Josh focused on what he called animal accommodations, detailed drawings of birdhouses, bat boxes, and his much-anticipated improved frog pond. On a crisp Saturday morning in late November, Sarah rose early and found Ray already on the porch, a steaming mug in his hands, watching the eastern sky lighten. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, joining him. "Good thoughts keeping me awake," he replied, offering a rare smile. "Wanted to see the sunrise." They stood in comfortable silence as the horizon bloomed pink and gold. Birds began their morning chorus, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called its final notes of the night. "The contractor is coming today," Sarah said eventually, "to finalize the addition plans." Ray nodded. "Helen's been up since 4, cleaning, as if the man cares about dust in corners." Sarah laughed softly. "She's excited. We all are." Ray turned to face her, his expression serious. "Before he gets here, before we make all this official, I need to ask you something." Sarah felt her heart quicken. Over the past months, their relationship had deepened gradually, neither rushing the delicate evolution from friends to something more. They hadn't put labels on what was growing between them, allowing it to develop organically like the healing land itself. "What is it?" she asked. Ray set down his coffee mug and took her hand in his, a gesture so uncharacteristic that it startled her. "I need to know that this is truly what you want," he said, his voice low and earnest. "Not just for the children, not just because it's practical or safe, but for yourself, Sarah." The use of her name, still rare from his lips, sent warmth through her despite the morning chill. "What exactly are you asking me, Ray?" His fingers tightened slightly around hers. "When we combine our households, when we expand this house, when we commit to raising these children together, I need to know that you're choosing this life, this place, this—" He hesitated, then finished simply, "Me." Sarah looked into his eyes, seeing the vulnerability beneath his usual stoic exterior. She thought of David, of the life they'd built together, of the grief that had nearly consumed her. She thought of the fire that had taken everything but somehow led them here, to this moment, to this choice. "I am choosing," she said softly, with complete clarity, "this life, this place." She turned her hand in his, interlacing their fingers. "You." Something in Ray's expression shifted, a tension releasing. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. When she didn't, he kissed her, a gentle, questioning kiss that carried the promise of deeper connection. When they separated, Sarah kept her hand in his. "We should probably tell the children," she said, a slight tremor in her voice. "They already know," Ray replied with unexpected humor. "Josh asked me last week if I was going to marry you, said it would make the paperwork easier." Sarah laughed, the sound bright in the morning air. "Out of the mouths of babes." "I told him," Ray continued, his voice growing serious again, "that some things can't be rushed, that good foundations take time to build." He looked toward the horizon, where the sun had now fully cleared the distant hills. "But that doesn't mean we're not already family." The sound of the screen door opening made them both turn. Helen stood there, dressed in her finest blouse, her silver hair braided and wrapped in a traditional style Sarah hadn't seen before. "The children are up," she announced, "and hungry as bears. Also, Tyler has redesigned the eastern bedroom windows." Again, her sharp eyes took in their clasped hands, and a knowing smile touched her lips. "About time," she murmured, turning back inside. Ray shook his head, a rare chuckle escaping him. "Nothing escapes her." "She approves," Sarah observed. "More than approves. She's been moving us in this direction since the day I brought you here." Ray's expression grew thoughtful. "She says the land knew before we did that it was healing itself through us." Did he? The words might have seemed mystical from anyone else, but standing there with the morning light illuminating the recovering landscape, Sarah understood the truth in them. The damaged earth was regenerating, just as their wounded hearts were, finding new capacity for connection and joy. "I believe her," Sarah said simply. They walked back into the house, hand in hand, toward the sounds of children's voices and the rich aroma of coffee and cinnamon rolls. Toward the future, they were building together on this sacred, healing ground. Spring arrived with an explosion of wildflowers across the healing landscape. Where fire had blackened the earth 6 months earlier, bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush now carpeted the gentle slopes in waves of color. The Miller Tamakera homestead had transformed as dramatically as the land itself. The guest house renovation had been completed just before the first winter frost. Through the coldest months, Sarah and her children had settled into a routine that gradually felt less temporary and more like a genuine home. Tyler had taken to rising early, joining Ray for morning chores with the horses before school. Emma spent afternoons with Helen in the kitchen, learning to prepare traditional foods and medicines. Josh, still the youngest at 8, had appointed himself official wildlife recorder, keeping meticulous journals of every creature that visited their corner of the property. Sarah stood on the small porch of the guest house, coffee mug warming, her hands in the early morning chill. From this vantage point, she could see across the valley to where her former ranch lay, now just a distant shape on the horizon. The insurance money had finally come through last week, forcing a decision she'd been avoiding. "Morning," Ray's voice came from the pathway. He approached with a toolbox dressed in work clothes, already spotted with sawdust. "Thought I'd finish the cabinet today, if that's okay." Sarah nodded, gesturing toward the house. "The children are still asleep. School holiday." Ray set down his tools and leaned against the porch railing. "Heard anything from that developer?" "Another call yesterday," Sarah admitted. "They've increased their offer." She hesitated. Significantly. Ray's expression remained carefully neutral. And I told them I'm still considering my options." Silence stretched between them, comfortable yet charged with unspoken possibilities. In the 6 months since the fire, their relationship had evolved into something neither of them had anticipated. A partnership built on shared work, mutual respect, and the gradual realization that they fit together in ways that defied easy explanation. "Helen says the first hummingbirds should arrive next week," Ray finally said, changing the subject. "She wants Emma to help prepare the feeders." Sarah smiled. "Emma's already planning it. She's been studying that bird identification book you gave her." Ray's face softened. "That girl absorbs knowledge like a sponge. All 3 of them do, in their different ways." Sarah agreed. She paused, then added, "Thank you for the astronomy set you got for Josh's birthday. He's been tracking the constellations every clear night." "Good knowledge to have," Ray said simply. "Connects him to this place." The mention of connection hung in the air between them. Sarah took a deep breath. "The school called yesterday, asked if I'd made a decision about enrollment for next year. They need to know if the children are staying." Ray looked at her steadily. "And what did you tell them?" "That I'd let them know by Friday." Sarah set down her coffee mug. "Ray, what we talked about last month, about us making this arrangement permanent. Were you serious? I don't say things I don't mean." His gaze remained unwavering. "But it has to be your choice. Completely. No obligation because we helped when you needed it." Sarah thought about the past months, how Tyler had blossomed, working alongside Ray with the horses, how Emma had found a kindred spirit in Helen and her vast knowledge of plants, how Josh's nightmares had finally stopped. She thought about the quiet evenings on Helen's porch, learning the stories of the land and the gradual healing that had taken place not just in the earth, but in her own heart. "It's not obligation," she said softly. "It's belonging. The children feel it too." Ray nodded, a barely perceptible release of tension in his shoulders. "Helen's been making lists of what we'd need to add to the house. More bookshelves, she says. Your kids have too many books." The hint of a smile touched his lips. "We could contribute the insurance money," Sarah offered. "For improvements, expansion, make it truly a shared home." "And your ranch?" Ray asked, his voice careful. Sarah hesitated. The developer's offer represented financial security, a safety net for her children's future. But the thought of the land being transformed into a suburban development, with the creek diverted and the natural habitat destroyed, sat like a stone in her stomach. "I've been thinking about that," she said slowly. What if we kept it, but differently, not to rebuild, but to restore it? Let it heal naturally, maybe plant native grasses, create a wildlife corridor." Ray's expression changed, a sudden intensity in his eyes. "A conservation easement," he said. "Legal protection for the land, tax benefits, prevents development. Permanently." "Is that possible?" Sarah asked, surprised by his immediate understanding. "More than possible. The Tribal Conservation Office has been working with ranchers throughout the watershed to create connected protected areas. Your land is a key piece. It connects the eastern forest with the riparian zones along the creek system." Sarah felt a weight lifting. So it could remain wild, healing. "It would be an extraordinary gift," Ray said quietly, "to the land, to the future." He looked out across the valley. "And a fitting memorial to your husband." The mention of David brought an unexpected comfort rather than pain. Ray had never met him, yet somehow understood the legacy David would have wanted to leave for his children. "I'd need help," Sarah admitted. "I don't know the first thing about conservation easements or land restoration." "I know people," Ray said simply. "Good people who've been doing this work for years. They can guide us through it." Sarah noted the "us" with quiet appreciation. "I'll call the developer today. Tell them the land is not for sale." Ray's smile was rare and transformative. "That'll be a good call." The sound of the screen door opening interrupted them as Josh bounded out in pajamas, wild-haired and excited. "Mom! Mr. Ray! The birds are back! The ones with the red wings!" "Hundreds of them down by the creek. Come see!" Ray ruffled the boy's hair. "Red-winged blackbirds. Let your mom finish her coffee, wild one. Then we'll all go look." Josh beamed up at him, the easy affection between them, a testament to how far they'd come. "Can we put up more nesting boxes? The ones we made last month are already full." "Might be a good weekend project," Ray agreed. "We'll draw up plans." Josh ran back inside, calling for his siblings to wake up and see the birds. "He doesn't talk about going back anymore," Sarah observed. "To our old place. None of them do." "Children adapt," Ray said. "They know where home is." Sarah met his eyes. "So do I." 2 days later, Sarah stood in the office of Marianne Rodriguez, the county's conservation program director, watching as the woman spread maps across her desk. "Your timing is perfect, Mrs. Miller," Marianne explained, tracing a finger along the watershed lines. "We've been trying to create a continuous protected corridor along this creek system for years. Your property is a critical link." Ray stood beside Sarah, occasionally offering clarifications about the land's features. "And this would be permanent?" Sarah asked. "No future owner could develop it?" "That's the purpose of a conservation easement," Marianne confirmed. "You retain ownership, but development rights are permanently restricted. The land must remain in its natural state, with allowances for sustainable activities like limited grazing or educational programs." "What about financial implications?" Sarah asked, thinking practically. "Property taxes, maintenance costs?" "The property taxes are significantly reduced on conservation land," Marianne explained. "And there are grant programs available for restoration projects. Some families even create small nature education programs that generate modest income while serving the community." Ray nodded. The Tribal Conservation Program offers support for native plant restoration. They'd consider your property high, a priority. Sarah studied the maps, seeing her land not as an isolated parcel, but as part of a living system extending far beyond property lines. The decision felt increasingly right. What would be the first steps, she asked. Marianne smiled, sensing her commitment. We conduct a full ecological assessment, document current conditions, develop a restoration plan, and draft the legal easement. It typically takes 3 to 6 months. And during that time, Sarah asked, the land begins healing itself. Ray answered, before Marianne could respond. Nature knows what to do if we let it. On the drive back to Helen's property, Sarah felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced since before David's death. The weight of uncertainty about their future had lifted, replaced by a clear vision of possibility. The children will be disappointed we can't rebuild the house, she mused aloud. Ray glanced at her. They might surprise you. Tyler was saying just last week that he prefers being closer to school and his new friends. He told you that? Sarah asked, surprised. Her oldest had become increasingly private as he navigated adolescence. While we were fixing fence, sometimes it's easier to talk when your hands are busy, Sarah smiled. You're good with him, with all of them. Ray kept his eyes on the road. They make it easy, good kids. When they returned home, they found Helen and the children gathered around the kitchen table, maps and drawings spread across the surface. Emma looked up eagerly as they entered. Grandma Helen's teaching us about the old trails, she exclaimed, using the term of affection she'd adopted for the older woman. The ones her ancestors used, Helen smiled, her weathered hands tracing lines on a hand-drawn map. Just passing along what my grandfather taught me. These children are quick studies. Tyler stood at the edge of the table, examining the maps with intensity. Did your family use the trails that crossed our ranch? He asked Sarah. Our old ranch, she corrected gently. And I don't know, honey. That's something we should learn about. That whole area was Comanche hunting territory, Helen explained. The creek system was a travel route for generations. Sarah exchanged glances with Ray, who nodded slightly, encouraging her to share. Their news. She pulled out a chair and sat down. I have something important to tell you all, she began. I've made a decision about our old property. The children gathered closer, sensing the significance of the moment. We're not going to sell it to the developers, Sarah explained, and we're not going to rebuild our house there either. Then what? Tyler asked, his brow furrowed. We're going to protect it, Sarah explained. Keep it wild, help the plants, and animals return. It's called a conservation easement. Emma's eyes widened, like a nature preserve. Very similar, Ray confirmed. The land will be allowed to heal and return to its natural state. What about where we're going to live? Josh asked, the practical one despite his young age. Sarah took a deep breath. I've been talking with Ray and Helen. If everyone agrees, we'd like to make our arrangement here permanent, expand the house, become one family. A moment of silence followed as the children processed this information. Does that mean Ray would be like our dad? Josh asked bluntly. Sarah felt heat rise to her face. Ray would be Ray, she said carefully. No one will ever replace your father, but we would be a family, yes, a different kind of family. I think Dad would like that, Tyler said quietly, surprising everyone. He always said land should be respected, and he'd want us to be happy. Emma nodded vigorously. I want to stay here with Grandma Helen and learn all the plant medicines. And my birds, Josh added. They need me. Helen's eyes glistened, with unshed tears. The house has been too quiet for too long, she said softly. It remembers when children's voices filled it. Ray placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder, a gentle touch of support. We thought we might build an addition off the east side, More bedrooms, a larger kitchen. Everyone would have their own space, but we'd be together. "Can I help design it?" Tyler asked, suddenly animated. "I've been studying Dad's woodworking books. I have ideas." "We'll need all the ideas we can get," Ray assured him. The following weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. The conservation assessment team visited the ranch property, documenting plant species, soil conditions, and wildlife evidence. Sarah walked the land with them, seeing it through new eyes, not as a loss, but as a promise. They identified springs she hadn't known existed, fossil evidence in the creek banks, and signs of returning wildlife already reclaiming the burned areas. At Helen's property, their home now, planning began for the expansion. Ray and Tyler drafted preliminary designs, spreading papers across the dining table each evening. Emma contributed garden plans, insisting on larger growing spaces and a greenhouse for winter. Josh focused on what he called animal accommodations, detailed drawings of bird houses, bat boxes, and butterfly gardens. On a Wednesday morning, in early April, Sarah was preparing to leave for her part-time job at the community college when an unfamiliar truck pulled into the driveway. The logo on the door read, "Weston Development." Brian Weston himself stepped out, dressed in an expensive suit that seemed out of place against the rural backdrop. Ray emerged from the workshop, wiping his hands on a rag, his expression cautious as he approached the visitor. "Mr. Weston," Sarah called, walking down from the porch. "I believe I was clear on the phone last week." Weston smiled, all practiced, charm and perfect teeth. "You were indeed, Mrs. Miller, but I thought this matter deserved a face-to-face conversation." He glanced toward Ray, then back to Sarah. "Perhaps somewhere private?" "Anything you have to say can be said in front of Ray," Sarah replied firmly. "He's family." Something flickered across Weston's face. Surprise, perhaps, or calculation. "As you wish." He reached into his suit jacket and withdrew a folder. "I've been authorized to increase our offer by another 20%. Considering the fire and damage, it's more than generous." Sarah took the folder, but didn't open it. "The land isn't for sale, Mr. Weston. We're placing it under a conservation easement." Weston's smile tightened. "I heard rumors about that, which is precisely why I'm here. Mrs. Miller, with all due respect, you're leaving a significant amount of money on the table, money that could secure your children's future, their education." "My children's future is secure," Sarah replied, "and they'll learn more from protecting that land than they would from selling it." Weston shifted tactics, turning slightly toward Ray. "Mr. Tahmakera, perhaps you could help Mrs. Miller understand the realities here. The development we're planning would bring jobs to the community, increase the tax base for better schools, create modern housing options." Ray's expression remained impassive. "Mrs. Miller understands the realities perfectly well. That land feeds the watershed that nourishes this entire region. Development would compromise water quality, wildlife corridors, and destroy cultural sites important to my people." "Cultural sites?" Weston repeated, his tone skeptical. "Our surveys didn't indicate any registered historical landmarks." "Not everything of value comes with a government registration," Ray replied evenly. Weston sighed, clearly frustrated. "Look, this development is happening with or without your particular parcel. We've acquired the neighboring properties already. You'll end up with a suburban view whether you sell or not. Why not benefit from the inevitable?" Sarah handed the folder back to him, unopened. "Because some things matter more than money. Mr. Weston, I appreciate your offer, but my decision is final." And as Weston drove away, a cloud of dust rising behind his truck, Sarah felt Ray's presence beside her. "You okay?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "Better than okay." That felt right. Ray's hand found hers, fingers intertwining. Helen would say, when you honor the land, it honors you back. Smart woman, your grandmother, Sarah replied, squeezing his hand. That evening, they gathered on the porch after dinner, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Helen sat in her favorite rocking chair, working on a beaded belt she was making for Emma. The children sprawled on the steps, Josh sketching in his nature journal, Emma reading, and Tyler cleaning the saddle Ray had given him for his responsibilities with the horses. I saw Mr. Weston today, Josh announced suddenly, the man in the fancy truck. Sarah glanced at Ray, surprised they hadn't mentioned the developer's visit to the children. I was up in the cottonwood by the creek, Josh continued, not looking up from his drawing. He came back after you went to work, Mum. He was taking pictures of our land. Ray straightened. Pictures of what exactly? Josh shrugged. The creek mostly, and he had a map. He was putting little marks on it. Sarah felt a chill despite the warm evening. Did he see you? Nope, Josh said proudly. I was being a research scientist on observation duty. Tyler set down the saddle. That's trespassing, isn't it? Yes, Ray confirmed, his voice tight. It is. Helen's rocking chair creaked rhythmically as she considered the situation. The man who doesn't respect boundaries will always reveal himself, she said finally. Perhaps it's time to make those boundaries clearer. The following morning, Sarah called Marianne Rodriguez, explaining what Josh had witnessed. The conservation officer was immediately concerned. We've had issues with Weston before, Marianne explained, taking soil samples without permission, conducting unauthorized surveys. I'll send someone out to your property today to document any evidence of trespassing. In the meantime, I'd recommend posting no trespassing signs along the property line. Can we do that if the easement isn't finalized? Sarah asked. Absolutely. You still own the land, and I'll expedite the easement paperwork. The sooner we get it recorded, the better protected you'll be. Ray took the day off from his landscaping job to accompany Sarah to the old ranch property. They brought Tyler along, both for the extra hands, and because Sarah felt it important that her eldest understand the situation. They loaded the truck with metal signs, posts, a post-hole digger, and other tools. As they drove through the scorched landscape of what had been their home, Sarah felt a complicated mix of emotions. The blackened foundation of the house still stood like a scar against the earth, but around it, life was returning. Tender green shoots pushing through ash, insects buzzing, birds calling from the trees that had survived the fire. It looks different, Tyler observed from the back seat. Smaller, somehow. Sarah understood what he meant. Their life there seemed increasingly distant, like a chapter closed rather than ongoing trauma. They parked near what had been the workshop and unloaded their supplies. Ray spread out a property survey map on the truck hood. We should focus on the creek boundaries first, he suggested. That's likely what Weston is most interested in. Then work our way around the perimeter. For the next several hours, they worked steadily, placing posts and signs at regular intervals along the property line. Tyler threw himself into the physical labor, digging holes and setting posts with a determination that reminded Sarah powerfully of his father. As they worked their way along the creek, Ray suddenly stopped, crouching to examine something in the soft earth near the water. What is it? Sarah asked, joining him. Footprints, Ray replied. Recent, and these indentations, survey stakes, they've been pulled up. Tyler looked concerned. That means someone's been surveying our land without permission. Ray nodded grimly, taking measurements, testing soil composition most likely. He pointed to small divots in the earth. Collection samples? That's illegal, right? Tyler asked, his voice tight with indignation. Very, Ray confirmed. Your mom should document this. Take photos of everything. Sarah used her phone to photograph the evidence while Ray collected one of the discarded stakes as proof. Tyler stood guard, his young face solemn with responsibility. Why would they do this when Mom already said no? Tyler asked as they continued their work. Ray considered his answer carefully. Some people believe that with enough pressure or money, everyone eventually changes their mind, or they look for legal loopholes to get what they want anyway. Like what? Tyler pressed. Like claiming the land is unsuitable for conservation, or that it's needed for essential infrastructure. Ray drove another post into the ground with controlled force, but we're not going to let that happen. By late afternoon, they had completed the boundary markings. As they loaded the remaining supplies back into the truck, a county conservation vehicle pulled up beside them. A young woman emerged, introducing herself as Lisa Blackhawk, one of Marianne's field officers. Marianne asked me to check out the potential trespass situation, she explained, shaking hands with Sarah and Ray. I see you've already taken security measures. We've also found evidence of unauthorized surveying, Ray told her, showing her the stake and leading her to the creek where the footprints remained visible. Lisa took detailed notes and photographs. This is helpful. We've been building a case against Weston for similar violations on other properties. She looked directly at Sarah. Are you familiar with the Sanderson Ranch about 10 miles north of here? Sarah nodded. They sold to Weston last year, I think. Yes, Lisa confirmed, after their property was mysteriously vandalized. Fences cut, livestock released, water sources contaminated. They couldn't prove it was connected to Weston, but the timing was suspicious. They felt too intimidated to stay. Sarah felt a cold knot form in her stomach. Are you saying we should be concerned about something similar? Lisa's expression was serious. I'm saying be vigilant. Install game cameras if you can. Document everything suspicious, and don't go out to this property alone for a while. On the drive home, Tyler was uncharacteristically quiet. Finally, as they turned onto the road leading to the Tamakera property, he spoke. I want to learn how to protect our land better, he said firmly. Both properties. Ray glanced at him in the rearview mirror. What are you thinking? Could we put up those trail cameras you told me about? The ones that send pictures to your phone? Tyler leaned forward between the front seats. And maybe you could teach me more tracking skills, how to tell if someone's been there who shouldn't be. Ray nodded thoughtfully. That's doable, good thinking. And maybe, Tyler added, his voice a little less certain, you could teach me how to use that rifle you keep in the workshop for protection. Sarah turned to look at her son, surprised by the request. She met Ray's eyes briefly, seeing the careful consideration there. Firearms are a serious responsibility, Ray said evenly, not something to be taken lightly. I know, Tyler insisted, but Dad was going to teach me when I turned 16, for hunting and protection, he said. I'm almost there now. Sarah felt the familiar pang that came whenever her children mentioned plans David had made for their futures. Plans cut short by his sudden death. But she also recognized the young man Tyler was becoming, his desire to protect what he loved. We'll discuss it, she said finally, but for now, trail cameras are a good start. The next few weeks brought a flurry of activity. On the conservation front, Marianne expedited the easement paperwork, and the preliminary ecological assessment was completed. The official report confirmed what they already suspected. The Miller property contained critical habitat for several threatened species and formed an essential corridor in the watershed ecosystem. At home, the house expansion plans were finalized, and construction was set to begin the following month. The architect, a friend of Ray's from the reservation, had designed an addition that blended seamlessly with the original structure, while providing space for their blended family to grow. Sarah's job at the community college had expanded from part-time administrative work to include teaching an introductory environmental science course. Her background in education, combined with her first-hand experience with land conservation, made her uniquely qualified for the position. On a warm Saturday in late April, the entire family drove out to the Miller property to install the trail cameras Tyler had researched. They positioned the devices strategically around the perimeter, focusing on likely entry points and the sensitive creek area. As Ray and Tyler secured the last camera to a sturdy oak, Emma and Josh explored the recovering landscape, Helen accompanying them at a more measured pace. Sarah watched them move among the new growth, pointing out discoveries to each other, comfortable in this place that held both painful memories and new purpose. "Mom," Emma called, waving excitedly from near the creek. "Come see what we found." Sarah made her way to where the children stood with Helen, gathered around something at the water's edge. "Look," Josh whispered, pointing to a patch of mud. There, clearly imprinted in the soft earth, was the distinct track of a large predator. 5 toes with claw marks, a rounded pad. "Mountain lion," Helen confirmed, her voice filled with quiet reverence. "A big one." "Is that good or bad?" Emma asked, looking between the adults. "It's extraordinary," Sarah replied. "Mountain lions need large, healthy territories. They wouldn't return unless the ecosystem was recovering." "Apex predators," Josh said knowingly, having absorbed this term from his wildlife books. "They're at the top of the food chain." Helen nodded approvingly. "When I was a girl, my grandfather would tell stories of the mountain lions that once roamed these hills. Then the ranchers and developers came. The lions disappeared." She studied the track thoughtfully. "Their return is a powerful sign." "A sign of what?" Emma asked. "Balance," Helen replied simply. "Healing." They carefully photographed and measured the tracks, adding the documentation to their growing record of the land's recovery. As they walked back to the others, Helen reached into the pouch she wore at her waist and withdrew a small object wrapped in soft leather. "I've been waiting for the right moment," she said, unwrapping the bundle to reveal a smooth stone pendant on a leather cord, etched with symbols none of them recognized except Ray, whose expression shifted to one of surprise. "Grandmother," he began, but Helen held up her hand to silence him. "When my people were forced from these hunting grounds generations ago, my great-grandfather took this from its sacred place," Helen explained, her voice taking on the cadence of storytelling. "He carried it rather than leave it to be desecrated by those who wouldn't understand its meaning. It has passed through our family ever since, waiting to return." "What is it?" Sarah asked softly. "A boundary marker," Helen replied. "In the old ways, it signified protected ground, sacred space, where all were welcome but none could harm." She held it out to Sarah. "It belongs here now, on this land you've chosen to protect." Sarah hesitated. "Helen, I couldn't possibly—" "You're not keeping it," the older woman interrupted, with a gentle smile. "You're returning it. There's a difference." Ray stepped forward. "Grandmother, are you certain? This has been in our family for—" "And it will remain connected to our family," Helen replied firmly. "Through the bonds we're creating, through the children who will grow knowing both sides of their heritage." Sarah accepted the pendant with trembling hands, feeling the weight of history and responsibility it carried. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll help us return it to its proper place," Helen said simply, "when the time is right." The moment was interrupted by the sharp beep of Ray's phone. He checked the screen, his expression darkening. "One of the cameras we just installed," he said, turning the phone so Sarah could see. "Motion detection. The image showed Brian Weston and two men in hard hats examining the creek bank, pointing to various features and consulting what appeared to be technical documents. "They didn't waste any time," Sarah said, anger rising in her chest. "And they ignored the no trespassing signs," Ray added grimly. Tyler peered at the image. "What do we do?" Ray's jaw tightened. "We document, we report, and we make it clear this won't be tolerated." They hurried back to the vehicles, Helen staying with Emma and Josh, while Sarah, Ray, and Tyler drove to the location shown on the camera feed. As they approached, they could hear voices carried on the wind. "The watershed assessment confirms this would be the optimal location for the retention pond," one of the men was saying. "We'd need to divert the creek approximately 200 yards upstream." "What about the conservation filing?" Weston asked. "Could that be a problem?" "Only if it's approved before we submit our infrastructure necessity application," the second man replied, "which is why timing is critical." Sarah felt her anger solidify into determination. She stepped from the truck, Ray and Tyler flanking her protectively. "You're trespassing, Mr. Weston," she called clearly. "Again." Three men turned, startled. Weston recovered quickly, his practiced smile sliding into place. "Mrs. Miller," he acknowledged, "just taking a walk to consider some regional planning issues." "With surveying equipment?" Ray gestured to the instruments one of the men carried. "On clearly marked private property. These are public waterways," the taller of Weston's companions countered. "Protected by easement for county infrastructure planning." "That's not accurate," Sarah replied firmly. "And you know it. The creek is entirely on private property until it joins the main branch 2 miles south. I suggest you leave immediately." "Before I call the sheriff." Weston's expression hardened. "Be reasonable, Mrs. Miller. This development is happening. Fighting it will only cost you money and goodwill in the community. People want the jobs and housing we're bringing." "What people want," Ray interjected, "is clean water and intact ecosystems. Your development threatens both." "The tribal reservation is 15 miles from here," Weston said dismissively. "This hardly affects your people." Ray's expression remained controlled, but Sarah could see the tension in his jaw. "Water doesn't recognize property lines or reservation boundaries," he replied evenly, "and neither do the consequences of destroying it." The standoff continued for several tense moments before Weston finally signaled to his companions. "We'll go, but this discussion isn't over, Mrs. Miller. Development is inevitable. You can either benefit from it or be overwhelmed by it." They watched as the three men retreated to a vehicle parked on the county road. Once they were gone, Sarah released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "They're planning something," she said quietly. "Something about infrastructure necessity?" Ray nodded grimly. "It's a legal maneuver. If they can convince the county that their development requires access to water resources on your property, they could potentially force an easement." "Can they do that?" Tyler asked, alarmed. "Not easily," Ray assured him. "But we need to warn Marianne right away." "Yeah." Back at home that evening, after reporting the incident to both the conservation office and the sheriff, the family gathered around the kitchen table for a strategy session. Emma and Josh had been sent to bed after dinner, but Tyler insisted on being included. "I want to understand what's happening," he argued, when Sarah suggested he get some rest. "It's my land too." Sarah recognized the echo of David in her son's stubborn determination. "You're right," she conceded. "You should be part of this." Marianne Rodriguez had arrived shortly after their call, bringing legal documents and maps. Helen prepared coffee, while Ray spread the materials across the table. "Weston's attempting a common developer tactic," Marianne explained, pointing to various sections of the county zoning maps. "They're trying to claim their development is essential infrastructure, specifically water management for flood control, which would give them rights to access your creek. Is there any legitimacy to their claim? Sarah asked. Marianne shook her head. Very little. The area has never had significant flooding issues, and there are alternative water management approaches that don't require creek diversion. However, they have political connections on the county commission that could complicate matters. What's our best defense? Ray asked, studying the maps. Speed and public awareness, Marianne replied. We need to finalize your conservation easement before they can file their infrastructure necessity application. And we need community support to counter their political influence. The Earth Day Festival is next weekend, Sarah noted. The college hosts it every year. Hundreds of people attend. Marianne's eyes lit up. Perfect. We could set up an information booth about watershed protection, specifically highlighting the role of your property in the larger ecosystem. I could bring some of my wildlife photographs, Tyler suggested eagerly. Show people what's returning to the land. And the historical significance, Helen added quietly. The sacred sites, the travel routes of my ancestors. People should understand what would be lost. They worked late into the night, developing a strategy that combined legal protection with community outreach. Sarah found herself drawing on skills from her teaching career, organizing information, creating compelling narratives, planning educational displays. Ray contributed his deep knowledge of the land and its ecology, while Helen provided cultural context that enriched their understanding of what they were fighting to protect. As the others finally departed for bed, Sarah remained at the table, sorting through photographs for their display. Ray returned from walking Marianne to her car and sat beside her. You should rest, he said gently. It's been a long day. Sarah nodded, but continued her work. Just a few more minutes. I want to find that picture of the wildflowers coming up through the ash. It's powerful. Ray watched her for a moment, then reached across the table to take her hand, stilling her movement. Sarah. She looked up, suddenly aware of the exhaustion settling into her bones. I know, I'm pushing too hard. You're fighting for something important, Ray corrected. For the land, for the children, for the future. But you don't have to do it alone. The simple statement, the acknowledgement of shared purpose, shared burden, broke something open in Sarah's chest. Tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed filled her eyes. I keep thinking about what David would do, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, how he would handle this. Ray's expression was gentle, without jealousy or discomfort at the mention of her late husband. What do you think he would do? Sarah considered the question seriously. He'd be practical, strategic. He'd gather allies and information. But mostly, he'd stand his ground because he believed in doing what was right, not what was easy. She wiped away a tear. He'd be proud of what we're doing. Ray squeezed her hand gently. Yes, he would. Especially of the children. They carry his strength. The acknowledgement, so simple, so profound in its acceptance of David's continued presence in their lives, warmed Sarah in ways she couldn't fully express. This was what had drawn her to Ray from the beginning, not just his quiet competence or his connection to the land, but his capacity to make space for what had come before. Thank you, she said softly, for understanding. Understanding is the easy part, Ray replied with the hint of a smile. Getting you to rest is the challenge. She laughed, allowing him to help her gather the scattered photos. Point taken. Tomorrow's another day. The Earth Day Festival arrived with perfect spring weather. Clear skies, gentle breezes, and temperatures warm enough for comfort, but cool enough for the outdoor activities planned across the community college campus. Sarah and Ray arrived early to set up their booth in the environmental education section, strategically positioned near the main walkway where festival goers would pass. Tyler took charge of mounting the wildlife photographs he'd taken over the past months. Deer returning to the recovering forest, birds nesting in the trees that had survived the fire, new growth emerging from blackened earth. Emma had created detailed botanical illustrations of native plants identified during the ecological assessment, while Josh contributed his meticulous field journal observations, complete with carefully labeled drawings of animal tracks. Helen arrived mid-morning, bringing with her several elders from the reservation, respected knowledge keepers who rarely participated in public events, but had agreed to come when Helen explained what was at stake. They brought historical photographs and maps showing the traditional uses of the watershed, adding depth and cultural context to the scientific information. "This is incredible," Marianne said when she stopped by to check their display. "You've created a powerful visual narrative of what conservation actually means." Sarah beamed with pride at the collaborative effort. "The response has been amazing. People keep telling us they had no idea how important that particular stretch of creek is to the larger ecosystem." "And the development issue?" Marianne asked quietly. "We're not directly attacking Weston's project," Ray explained, "just educating about watershed protection in general. More effective that way." Marianne nodded approvingly. "Smart approach. Oh, and I have news. The conservation easement paperwork cleared legal review yesterday. We're on track for final approval next week, well ahead of any infrastructure application Weston might file." As the day progressed, their booth attracted increasing attention. Local teachers brought student groups through, county commissioners stopped by. Even the mayor spent time examining their displays and asking questions. Sarah found herself drawing on her teaching experience, explaining complex ecological concepts in accessible terms, while Ray and Helen provided insights about sustainable land management from both scientific and traditional perspectives. Late in the afternoon, Sarah noticed Brian Weston himself moving through the festival crowd, pausing occasionally to speak with people he recognized. His expression darkened when he spotted their booth and the group gathered around it. After a moment's hesitation, he changed direction and approached. "Quite the propaganda campaign, Mrs. Miller," he said quietly, examining the watershed map they'd created. "Very professional." "It's educational, not propaganda," Sarah corrected calmly. "Everything presented here is factually accurate and scientifically sound." Weston's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Facts can be selective. For instance, your display doesn't mention the tax revenue, jobs, and housing that development brings to communities. Those would be relevant points at an economic development booth," Ray interjected. "This is about watershed ecology." Weston turned his attention to Ray, his expression cooling further. "Mr. Tamakera, always the conservationist. I understand your tribal council recently rejected a very lucrative resort development proposal for reservation land. Some might call that economically short-sighted." "Some might," Ray agreed evenly. "Others would call it wisdom, prioritizing water and land for future generations over short-term profit." Helen approached, standing beside Ray with quiet dignity. She said nothing, but her presence altered the dynamic, her elder status commanding an instinctive respect that even Weston seemed to feel. "Mrs. Tamakera," he acknowledged with a nod. "I've heard you're quite knowledgeable about traditional plant uses." "Knowledge isn't something to be quite about," Helen replied. "It's something to be shared and preserved." She gestured to the cultural heritage section of their display. "This creek system has nourished my people for countless generations. The pictographs on the north ridge of Mrs. Miller's property tell stories that predate European contact. Some things have value beyond dollars." Weston seemed momentarily at a loss, clearly unaccustomed to having his economic arguments countered with cultural perspectives he couldn't easily dismiss. Before he could respond, The festival coordinator approached their booth with a local television reporter in tow. "Mrs. Miller, your watershed display has been voted most educational by festival attendees," the coordinator announced brightly. "Channel 7 would like to interview you for the evening news." Weston's expression tightened as he stepped back. "Another time, perhaps," he said, nodding curtly before walking away. The television interview extended their message far beyond the festival itself. Sarah, Ray, and Helen each spoke briefly about different aspects of watershed conservation, while Tyler demonstrated the wildlife camera system they'd installed to document the land's recovery. By the time the segment aired on the evening news, their phones were buzzing with messages of support from throughout the community. "I'd call that a successful day," Ray observed as they unloaded the display materials at home that evening. The children had already gone inside with Helen, exhausted but exhilarated by the public response to their work. "More than successful," Sarah agreed. "Did you see Weston's face when those county commissioners spent so much time at our booth? He's realizing this won't be the easy push-through he expected." Ray nodded, his expression thoughtful. "He won't give up easily, though. Men like that rarely do." "Then neither will we," Sarah said firmly, closing the truck tailgate with a decisive thud. The following week brought both triumph and new challenges. On Tuesday, Marianne called with the news they'd been hoping for. The conservation easement had received final approval and been officially recorded. The Miller property was now permanently protected from development, its ecological and cultural resources preserved for future generations. They celebrated that evening with a special dinner, all of them gathered around Helen's table that now truly belonged to their blended family. Even Tyler, usually careful about maintaining his teenage dignity, joined enthusiastically in the toasts and laughter. "I was thinking," he said during a lull in the conversation, "now that the legal protection is in place, maybe we could start that educational program we talked about, taking school groups out to learn about conservation and restoration." "I'm already planning it," Sarah confirmed with a smile. "The college has approved using the site for my environmental science field studies course next semester. And my friend Jake's dad is a contractor," Tyler continued excitedly. "He said he might be able to help us build that small observation platform we designed down by the creek where you can see across the whole valley." Ray nodded approvingly. "That's good thinking. Educational infrastructure is permitted under the conservation easement." "What about that old workshop foundation?" Emma asked. "Could we build something there too?" "Actually," Sarah exchanged glances with Ray, "we've been talking with Marianne about using that area for a small interpretive center, basic shelter, educational displays, maybe even a tiny classroom space for when the weather's bad." Helen smiled, watching the enthusiasm spread among the children. "From ashes to renewal," she said softly, "as it should be." The family's celebration was interrupted by the simultaneous chiming of Ray's and Sarah's phones. Ray checked his screen. First, his expression immediately shifting to concern. "Trail camera alert," he said tersely. "Motion detection at the creek boundary." Sarah reached for her phone, opening the notification to reveal a nighttime image of two men in dark clothing moving along the creek bank. They carried what appeared to be long-handled tools and wore headlamps that illuminated the ground before them. "That's not Weston," she said quietly, studying the image. "No," Ray agreed grimly, "but they're not there by accident either." Tyler came around the table to look at the photo. "What are they doing?" "I can't tell for certain," Ray replied, "but it looks like they might be tampering with the creek bank or taking soil samples." "Should we call the sheriff?" Sarah asked. Ray nodded, already dialing. "I'll also contact Marianne. This could be related to that infrastructure application we were worried about." The sheriff's deputy arrived at the property within 30 minutes, meeting Ray and Sarah at the access gate. They had decided to leave the children at home with Helen, despite Tyler's protests that he should be involved. Motion sensors caught them about 20 minutes ago, Ray explained, showing the deputy the camera feeds on his phone. No new images since then, so they could still be on the property. The deputy nodded seriously. "Let me take a look. Stay behind me, please." They followed the deputy along the fence line toward the creek, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. As they approached the location shown in the camera images, they heard the sound of an engine starting up. "Someone's leaving," the deputy said, quickening his pace. They reached the creek bank just in time to see taillights disappearing down the county road. The deputy radioed the vehicle description to dispatch, requesting another unit intercept if possible. "Let's check for damage," Ray suggested, directing his flashlight along the creek. It didn't take long to discover what the intruders had been doing. At 3 locations along a 100-yard stretch, the creek bank had been deliberately undermined, creating unstable sections that would likely collapse with the next heavy rain. "They're trying to alter the creek course," Ray said in disbelief. "Force it to cut a new channel." The deputy photographed the damage, shaking his head. "Deliberate vandalism. I'll file a report, but catching them will be difficult unless the unit intercepted that vehicle." Back at home, Sarah called Marianne to report what they'd found. The conservation officer was outraged, but not entirely surprised. "It's a desperate move," Marianne said. "With the easement recorded, Weston's running out of legal options. If he could document the creek naturally changing course, he might argue that the original easement boundaries need adjustment." "Can they really get away with that?" Sarah asked incredulously. "No," Marianne assured her. "We have the camera evidence, and we'll get hydraulic engineers out there tomorrow to document and repair the damage, but it shows they're not giving up." The incident marked a turning point in their conflict with Weston Development. What had been primarily a legal and regulatory challenge became a more direct confrontation. Over the next several weeks, they dealt with a series of escalating problems. Fence cutting, threatening phone calls, even an anonymous complaint to Child Protective Services alleging unsafe conditions at the Tamakera property that was quickly determined to be unfounded. Through it all, the family drew closer together. The children became more involved in monitoring and protecting both properties, developing a deep connection to the land that transcended ownership. The house expansion progressed steadily, transforming the physical space to reflect their growing bonds. Community support strengthened as well. Neighbors organized a rotating schedule to drive by the conservation property regularly. Local environmental groups held educational events, highlighting their watershed protection effort. The Tribal Council passed a resolution supporting the preservation of cultural sites in the creek system. On a warm day in early June, exactly 1 year after the fire that had destroyed their home and altered their lives, Sarah stood with her family on the newly constructed observation platform overlooking the Miller Conservation Easement. The charred landscape had transformed remarkably, with native grasses waving in the breeze and wildflowers painting the hills in splashes of color. "Hard to believe it's only been a year," she said softly, her arm linked through Ray's. "Land remembers how to heal itself," Helen observed, when given the chance. They had gathered for a significant occasion, the ceremonial return of Helen's ancestral boundary marker to its traditional location. After consulting with tribal elders and conservation officials, they had identified a natural stone outcropping near the creek that aligned with Helen's family stories of its original placement. "Are we ready?" Sarah asked, looking around at her family. Tyler, Emma, and Josh nodded solemnly, understanding the importance of the moment. Ray stood beside his grandmother, supporting her as they made their way to the designated spot. Helen removed the stone pendant from its leather wrapping, holding it toward the sun for a moment before passing it to Sarah. "You found the path. To protect this land," she said, "you should help return what was taken from it." Together, Sarah and Helen placed the marker into the small niche in the rock face that seemed formed precisely for this purpose. Ray secured it with a mixture of natural clay and plant resin prepared according to Helen's instructions. "Now we give thanks," Helen said, her voice steady despite her age, "for the circle that closes today, for the healing that continues, for the family that grows from different roots but shares one ground." As they stood in silence, a sudden movement caught their attention. From the edge of the newly healing forest, a deer stepped cautiously into the open, a magnificent buck with a full rack of antlers. It regarded them calmly for a long moment before turning back toward the trees, unhurried and unafraid. "He approves," Josh whispered, his 8-year-old face alight with wonder. "Yes," Helen agreed simply. "He does." They walked back toward their vehicles in comfortable silence, each absorbed in their own thoughts about the significance of the day. As they crested the final rise, Sarah paused, looking back at the vast expanse of healing land stretching toward the horizon. "What are you thinking?" Ray asked quietly, coming to stand beside her. "That some endings are really beginnings," she replied, "and that sometimes what looks like destruction is actually a path to something better than we could have imagined." Ray's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining naturally. Helen would say the land knew what it was doing all along. Sarah smiled, gazing out at the restored creek, the emerging forest, the family walking ahead of them, their family, forged in fire and flourishing against all odds. "I'm starting to believe she's right," she said, and together they turned toward home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.